the unseen heroes of medieval winter. As the wind howls through the night, imagine yourself standing in a remote medieval village, the sharp cold biting through your clothes, your breath forming mist in the frozen air. The world outside is bleak, unforgiving. Snow falls in heavy, unrelenting sheets, covering the ground like a white shroud. The winds howl like angry spirits, relentless in their fury. And you, a medieval peasant, huddle inside a cramped, drafty hut, struggling to keep warm. It's hard to even call it a home, more like a crude shelter, a patchwork of sticks, mud, and whatever else could be salvaged. There are no soft blankets, no luxury of hot water, no furnace to chase away the chill. Instead, you're left with the raw, bitter reality of surviving winter in one of the harshest periods in human history. The walls of your hut, made of mud, sticks, and dried dung, are thin and fragile. They offer little protection against the cold, and there are no windows, only small openings stuffed with skins of animals to keep the freezing wind from blowing straight through. The hearth crackles in the center of the room, trying its best to ward off the cold, but the fire is small, flickering, and easily snuffed out by the winds that slip through every crack in the walls. You don't have much. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of hay stuffed into a rough sack, with a few stray reeds thrown in for comfort. The cold creeps in through the floor and the walls, making it feel like you're sleeping directly on the frozen ground. The simple act of tossing and turning in your sleep becomes a struggle, each movement a desperate attempt to find warmth. You layer yourself with every scrap of clothing you own. Thick wool tunics, maybe an old cloak that smells faintly of goat, and your hope that you can somehow become a human onion, layering the fabric for some sort of insulation. But it doesn't work. The cold still finds a way in. And yet you endure. This isn't just any winter. It's a test. The kind that pushes your limits, breaks your spirit, and forces you to make do with whatever you have. Each night is a battle for survival, for warmth, for the small luxury of waking up to another frozen morning. There are no promises, no comforts. The cold can kill, and it does so every year. Yet, year after year, you and your fellow peasants find ways to survive, using tricks, creativity, and sheer will to withstand the frozen nights. As you lie there, the howling wind outside seems almost like a personal attack, as if nature itself has decided to test how much a person can bear. You huddle closer to your family, the warmth of their bodies your only hope for making it through another night. There is no privacy, no comfort, just the collective warmth of your family, your livestock, and perhaps a few fleeting moments of sleep. Every night the fear is there. Will the fire go out? Will the cold get too much? It's a constant battle. But these are the forgotten heroes of history, the medieval peasants, whose lives are often overlooked, but whose resilience and ingenuity shaped the very fabric of survival. They were the ones who faced the harshest winters with grit and determination. And as you curl into the cold embrace of your makeshift bed, you realize that this is survival, raw, uncomfortable, and unglamorous, but it's life. And it's a victory, the cold and the hearth. Now, let's step into the heart of the medieval peasant's survival strategy. The hearth. This small fire pit in the center of the room isn't just a luxury. It's the lifeline. In the dead of winter, the hearth is the most valuable possession, far more important than any food, any clothing, or any bed, is a symbol of life itself. Without it, survival is impossible. The fire is what keeps the chill at bay, what provides light, warmth, and comfort, if you can even call it that. There are no fireplaces here, no elegant chimneys to sweep the smoke upward. Instead, the fire is a pit, a simple arrangement of stones and half-burned logs. Smoke pours into the room, thick and acrid, settling into your lungs, your skin, your clothes. The smoke is ever present, like a constant reminder that you're living on the edge. But it has its uses, kills fleas, burns away pests, and sometimes even provides a bit of warmth if you're lucky enough to sit directly in front of it. But for everyone else, you might as well be outside braving the wind. Keeping the fire alive isn't easy. It's not like flicking a switch or striking a match. There are no modern conveniences here, only the harsh reality of flint, steel, and kindling. You have to coax the fire into existence one spark at a time. And if the fire goes out in the middle of the night, you don't just light a new match. No, you have to work for it. The next morning, if you're lucky, you might be able to bank the fire from the night before, tucking the embers under a mound of ash to keep them alive for a few hours longer. But if you don't get it right, you'll wake up to an icebox of a home, the cold creeping in faster than you can think. And still, you fight. You make sure the fire is stoked, the embers watched, and the hearth never left to die. It's the only thing standing between you and a freezing death. Families gather around it, children learning from an early age how to tend to the flame. And for those few hours before the fire dies down, it becomes the heart of the home, a place of warmth, a place of light, a place of life. But the fire isn't just a physical warmth. It's a symbol. It represents hope, resilience, and the unyielding will to survive. Without it, everything else, your clothes, your bed, your makeshift insulation, means nothing. The fire is the thing that connects all medieval peasants, whether they know it or not. It's the thin thread that holds their existence together. The walls and the cold a fight against nature. When you think of home, what do you imagine? Comfort, warmth, a refuge from the harsh world outside. Now, erase that idealized version from your mind. Replace it with the reality of a medieval peasant's home. Picture it. The walls are made of sticks and mud, plastered with a mixture of animal dung, straw, and whatever other materials could be scavenged. It's not charming or picturesque. It's a desperate attempt to shield yourself from nature's relentless attack. The walls, no matter how thick or carefully crafted, are thin. There's no insulation, no modern technology to make it bearable. When the wind howls through the night, it doesn't just whisper past. It screams through the cracks, tearing through the fragile walls as if they weren't even there. You hear it, you feel it, the coldness cutting straight through your bones. There's no escaping it. The walls might offer some protection, but only just. And if the snow or rain is particularly brutal, the water creeps in from every possible opening. The roof sags under the weight of the storm, the thatch soaked through, allowing not only rain to fall but also the occasional critter to drop in uninvited. Imagine sitting down for your meager meal, only to be showered by a squirrel falling from the rafters. If you think you have privacy, think again. The design of your home, if you can even call it that, is as open and communal as the cold makes it. It's one room, shared with your family, your livestock, your possessions, and even your bedmates, or whatever semblance of a bed you can manage. No personal space, no cozy corners, just bodies pressed together, trying to survive the long, bitter night. The fire in the hearth is the only thing standing between you and total isolation, flickering through the cracks in the wall, casting long shadows across the room. Your house may have a roof, but in the winter, it feels more like a sieve, with wind finding every crack to crawl through, testing the limits of human endurance. What makes this cold even more dangerous is the ground beneath you. Your floors aren't made of warm, polished wood or soft rugs. There's no luxury here. The floors are nothing more than the hard-packed earth, cold and unforgiving. During the wet months, the earth turns to a quagmire, and every step inside your own home feels like you're trekking through a bog. When you wake up in the morning, you'll find your feet chilled from the ground below, and you'll be lucky if the frost hasn't already settled in, making your toes feel like they belong to someone else. When winter sets in, it's not just an inconvenience. It's a battle for survival. There's no escaping the relentless cold. You can huddle together for warmth, layer on the old, worn clothing, and sit close to the fire, but the cold still seeps in, creeping under your skin, settling deep in your bones. You fight with everything you've got to keep the warmth you've earned, but at some point, survival isn't about comfort. It's about making it through another night, another frostbitten morning. You learn to adapt to this uncomfortable existence, to live with the cold rather than fight it, because fighting is futile. Creative survival, the ingenuity of the peasants. But the medieval peasants weren't just passive victims to the elements. No, they were resourceful, inventive survivors, fighting back with ingenuity and creative survival techniques that were often passed down through generations. In the face of such a harsh reality, they found ways to make do, to adapt, and just as importantly, to laugh. For example, when the wind howled through the cracks, peasants didn't just accept it. They patched up the gaps, filled them with moss, old rags, or scraps of cloth. If the gaps were big enough, they stuffed them with bundles of dry grass. Anything they could find to block the cold's entry. They learned to seal their homes from within. Moss, animal hair, and anything that could hold heat was used to fill the cracks in the walls. Some even went so far as to apply a thick layer of mud and dung to the outside of the house. It wasn't pretty, but it was practical. It kept the worst of the wind at bay, making the difference between freezing and surviving. And then there were the beds. As uncomfortable as they were still crucial. The straw, hay, and rushes may have been damp and moldy, but they offered a modicum of insulation against the cold ground. Even if you couldn't escape the discomfort, at least you could sleep, knowing that you weren't entirely at the mercy of the frozen earth beneath you. There were no soft mattresses or luxurious blankets, just rough, hard-packed straw, sometimes shared by multiple family members, and maybe even a few fleas for company. The peasants didn't have the luxury of complaining. Their beds were often made from whatever they could get their hands on, but they made do. They understood that sleep wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. These peasants didn't just endure the cold. They fought it with everything they had, using creativity, stubbornness, and even a bit of humor. There was no choice but to get inventive. They didn't have modern heating systems, thick woolen coats, or any of the comforts we take for granted today. But what they did have was each other, and their sheer determination to live. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to keep the cold at bay, to hold on to a thread of warmth in a world that seemed determined to freeze them out. The heart of the home, fire and family. The hearth. For medieval peasants, it was far more than just a fire. It was life itself. The hearth was the beating heart of every home. Without it, survival was nearly impossible. The fire was the only defense against the cold, a fragile lifeline that could mean the difference between life and death. But getting and maintaining that fire was no easy task. Imagine trying to keep a fire going in a small, drafty hut made of sticks, mud, and dung. It's not like today, where we can flick a switch and be instantly warm. No, this fire needed constant care. Every night, after a day spent working the land or tending to animals, the peasants had to bank the fire for the night. If they didn't, they risked waking up to a frozen home, a frigid morning that would make getting out of bed feel like an impossible task. Banking the fire was an art form. It wasn't just about keeping it alive. It was about ensuring that when the cold night crept in, the embers were still glowing come morning. Peasants would carefully cover the glowing coals with a blanket of ash, tucking them in for the night, hoping that when dawn broke, a few warm embers would remain, ready to be reignited. If done right, the morning fire could be revived with just a few scraps of dry kindling and a lot of patience. If done wrong, however, the family would wake up in the cold, faced with the impossible task of getting a fire started again from scratch in the bitter morning chill. The fire didn't just provide warmth, it was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the social center of the household. Families huddled around the hearth, telling stories, gossiping, or simply staring into the flames. It was the one place where everyone gathered. The fire, for all its imperfection, was a shared experience. It was what brought people together in the dead of winter, when isolation and the cold could easily break the spirit. But keeping the fire going wasn't just about physical warmth. It was a spiritual act. The fire was central to the survival of the family. Without it, the cold would win. And so, the peasants did everything they could to protect it. Even when their homes were falling apart, they made sure the hearth remained the one thing that could never be allowed to go out. Part 6. The power of the family togetherness in the cold. When the winds howled, the snow piled up, and the nights stretched on, the medieval peasants didn't face it alone. They couldn't. In a world where the cold could freeze you to death in a single night, the importance of family and community was the ultimate survival tactic. It wasn't just about having enough blankets or warm food. It was about huddling together, using your bodies to shield each other from the cruel grip of winter. On the coldest nights, personal space didn't exist. The family became a human blanket, a desperate attempt to share body heat. The kids squeezed in between the parents, the elders huddled under the outer layers, and anyone who wasn't on fire watch or too sick to sleep found a spot in the heap. The goal wasn't comfort, it was survival. The idea was simple. The more bodies pressed together, the warmer everyone would be. Even livestock, like goats, pigs, or chickens, were brought indoors to share the warmth of the fire. If you were lucky, you were nestled in the middle of the pile, with warmth on all sides. If not, you were stuck on the edge, near the icy draft by the door. And forget about privacy. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of personal space or quiet alone time. They didn't even have the luxury of good hygiene. It was one body after another, crammed into a tiny room, each person trying to find a warm spot and trying not to freeze. They even shared the bed in the most intimate sense, with each other and with animals. Goats, sheep, chickens, and pigs all came indoors for the night. The warmth they provided was necessary, even if the smells they brought along weren't. The air in these homes was thick with the scent of wet wool, manure, and animal fur. But in the winter months, it was the smell of survival. Yet, despite the discomfort, the cold, and the animals sharing their beds, the family bond remained strong. These winters weren't just about enduring the cold, they were about enduring it together. When one person suffered, everyone suffered. But when one person found warmth, everyone found it. The bonds created in those long, cold nights were forged through the need to survive, to share warmth, and to keep each other alive. There were no luxuries in this world, but there was love, there was shared purpose, and there was a sense of survival that was built on a foundation of togetherness. Even though life was harsh and the odds were stacked against them, the medieval peasants found ways to get through the worst winter nights. They found warmth not just from the fire, but from the people around them. And together, they fought the cold until the first signs of spring began to appear, bringing hope and survival into another year. Part 7. The Trials of the Earth Living with the Cold. While the hearth provided warmth in the night, there was another battle waged every day in the cold depths of the earth. The ground, unforgiving and cold, reached up to steal warmth from beneath, turning every step inside the house into a battle for survival. The floors in most medieval peasant homes were nothing more than packed dirt. No carpets, no cozy rugs to shield bare feet from the frozen earth. If you were lucky, a few layers of straw might soften the floor's bite, but those layers would flatten and become a mushy, unpleasant mess by the end of winter. The air was thick with moisture, making the homes damp and frigid, and if it rained or snowed heavily, the water would seep through, creating muddy puddles inside. Imagine trying to sleep, curled up on a straw mattress with the ground beneath you just as cold as the air outside. The straw provided a tiny barrier, but it did little to prevent the freeze from creeping up through the floor and gnawing at your bones. And there was no escaping it. The cold from below was just as powerful as the cold from the wind, a constant force that wouldn't let you forget for a second that winter was here, and it was relentless. The earth beneath the floor didn't just threaten your warmth, it also threatened your health. The cold and dampness could seep into your body, making even the healthiest individuals vulnerable to sickness, and the elderly, children, or the frail were especially at risk. As if that wasn't enough, the peasants had to contend with something else. Critters. Mice, rats, fleas, and lice all loved the warmth that came with the dirt and straw, making it an even more miserable place to rest. But the real challenge came in the morning, when the cold had settled deep into the earth and up through the floorboards, leaving the peasants with stiff, frozen limbs and a morning that felt like a never-ending struggle to thaw. Part 8. Food for the soul, the fuel that keeps you going. With the cold creeping in from all sides, both inside and outside, food became a critical source of warmth. But not just any food. The type of meals that kept peasants going through the long winters were hearty, dense, and designed to stick to your ribs. Light, delicate fare wouldn't cut it when the temperatures plummeted to freezing. The people who lived through these winters needed calories that would keep their bodies burning hot throughout the night. Picture the table, modest as it may have been, covered with thick stews and breads, each bite more of a necessity than a pleasure. Stews made with root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and potatoes with grains like barley and oats to thicken the broth would fill bellies and keep the cold at bay. If you were lucky, perhaps there would be a slice of salted pork, a piece of hard cheese, or a meager hunk of dried sausage. Nothing extravagant, nothing fancy, but enough to keep you alive. Medieval peasants were smart about their eating habits, too. They understood the magic of fat in winter. It wasn't just for flavor, it was fuel. Fatty foods took longer to digest, which meant the body stayed warmer for longer. Every meal was about survival, not indulgence. As much as the peasants might have loved a hearty stew, it wasn't about comfort food. It was about keeping their body heat steady through the night. If they could finish a meal and still feel warm enough to sleep, they knew they'd made it through another day. But there was a cost to this kind of eating. Heavy meals didn't always sit well in the belly, and the uncomfortable fullness could make sleep a challenge. Still, with the frost biting outside and the ever-present danger of hypothermia, what was a little indigestion compared to the warmth that food could bring? Part 9. A journey of innovation, getting through the nights. Despite the extreme cold, the medieval peasants were survivors, not just of the environment, but of the many challenges that came with the relentless winter. They learned to get creative, to use the resources at their disposal in ways that would seem impossible to us today. Whether it was wrapping up in every layer of clothing they could find or huddling together with livestock, their resilience in the face of such adversity was nothing short of awe-inspiring. But they didn't just survive, they adapted. They found ways to keep their homes warm, even with the walls falling apart. The ingenuity they showed in the face of constant cold is a testament to human determination. In the battle for warmth, peasants also found ways to make use of every scrap of material. Blankets were scarce, so they used what they could: rough spun wool, patched up tunics, even old rags. If you could find it, it was wrapped around your body. No layer was too small to be used. And when it came to footwear, boots were a rare luxury. Most peasants wrapped their feet in cloth or leather scraps, stuffing them into whatever wooden clogs they could make. If the cold still bit through, more cloth was added, creating what can only be described as medieval makeshift snow boots. Yet, even with all the layers, the clothing wasn't perfect. The rough wool would itch, the animal furs would smell, and the constant dampness would chill to the bone. But somehow they endured. They adapted to the discomfort because the alternative, freezing to death, was simply too great a threat to ignore. Each layer they wore was more than just clothing. It was a shield against the elements, an armor they crafted from necessity, not choice. Part 10. The spirit of survival, community, and resilience. In the cold, bitter nights, with the wind howling and the fire sputtering, the peasants didn't survive alone. They survived because of community. The bond between family members was the ultimate protection against the dark, cold world outside. As harsh as the conditions were, there was a deep, unspoken understanding that survival depended on working together. And that connection was vital. It wasn't just about surviving the nights, either. It was about the moments of joy, however fleeting they were, shared in the warmth of the fire. It was the songs, the stories, the laughter that kept spirits alive. The medieval peasant's life was one of hardship, but it was also one of warmth, of human connection that transcended the bitter winds and the never-ending cold. Through every winter, despite the suffering, the peasants carried on. They had no choice, but they also had something stronger than the cold: the will to live and the strength of their community. In the end, the story of the medieval peasant isn't one of defeat, but of perseverance. Part 11. The sounds of survival, rituals, and winter evenings. As the cold wind howled outside, the warmth inside the peasant's home wasn't just about the crackling fire or the thick layers of clothing. It was also about the sounds that filled the air, small, constant rhythms that were as much a part of survival as the fire itself. In the flickering light, there was often the low hum of a song being sung by a tired but hopeful voice, or the soft tapping of a foot in time to the beat of a drum, the warmth of the music an unexpected companion to the cold. The nights were long in medieval homes. Once the sun had set, the world outside faded into darkness, but inside, the family gathered. The fire's soft crackle and the wind's mournful howl were replaced by voices, laughter, and the familiar sounds of daily life. There were no television screens, no radios, no distractions. Just the people, the fire, and the quiet, intimate world they shared. Children learned to move with the rhythm of survival from the youngest of ages, imitating the elders' careful steps in their movements, in their breath, and, in the case of the lucky few, in their songs. The simple melody of a lullaby, often passed down through generations, was as much a part of the warmth as the fire in the hearth. These songs, sung in the low light, gave meaning to the bleak winter nights. It was in the music that the peasants found some respite from the bitter cold, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was warmth in human connection. As the fire burned low, the children would gather around the hearth. Some of them would kneel close to the fire, feeling its warmth on their hands or faces, while others would sit with the elders, listening closely to the stories being shared. The elderly, who had lived through many winters, would recount tales of their own struggles, victories, and the wisdom they had accumulated over the years. They spoke of hardships, but there was always the undercurrent of resilience, a resilience they hoped to pass on to the younger generations. And sometimes, if the weather permitted, there would be dancing, however small. Peasants didn't need grand celebrations or ballrooms. The simple act of moving, even if it was just swaying to the beat of a drum, created warmth between bodies. These dances might have been brief, but they were powerful. A shared rhythm that stitched together the community in ways words alone never could. The hearth, with its glowing embers and crackling wood, became the center of every winter evening, bringing not only warmth but also light in more ways than one. Part 12. A time of reflection, survival, and memory. Though the medieval winter was a time of hardship, it was also a time for reflection. The cold forced people to slow down. With fewer hours of daylight and less work to be done outdoors, people had time to think, to remember, and, in some cases, to dream. Dreams of warmer days, of feasts, of harvests that seemed so far away. These became the mental escape for many. As they sat together by the fire, stories of old legends would be retold, giving people a sense of connection to the past, a connection that transcended their own suffering. In some homes, family members might take turns telling stories or singing songs of their ancestors. The stories they told were full of bravery, of overcoming the odds, and of community resilience. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were the moral compass that guided the family through each cold night. These traditions, passed down through the generations, gave people a sense of continuity, reminding them that even when the cold was unbearable, they were part of something bigger than themselves. And while the community bond was vital, so too was the individual's connection to their own survival. The peasants who lived through these bitter winters didn't do so in isolation. They drew on the strength of their families, of their neighbors, and of the collective wisdom of their ancestors. Every winter they passed down knowledge, how to keep a fire alive through the night, how to layer clothes for maximum warmth, how to find safety in numbers, and how to hold on to hope even when everything seemed bleak. For the medieval peasant, winter was a time not just of survival, but of understanding the earth, the cold, and the simple but profound truth that surviving the winter meant more than just enduring the elements. It was about outlasting the loneliness, the darkness, and the endless chill, and it was about realizing at the end of each day that you had made it through once again. Winter's cold might have been unrelenting, but the human spirit was even more so. Part 13. The promise of spring, a cycle of renewal. As the winter dragged on, every peasant house held onto one singular, unspoken truth. Spring would come. In the deepest cold of winter, the promise of spring felt distant, almost impossible. But it was there waiting. The first signs, the slightest hint of warmth in the air, the first buds on trees, the birds' return, were moments that made the entire community stir with anticipation. Even in the hardest times, peasants understood the cycles of the earth. They knew that after the harshest winter came the brightest spring. The promise of the harvest, the promise of light, and the promise of survival for one more year. They didn't just endure the winter. They prepared for it, knowing that the struggle would end, and with it, the cycle of life would begin again. Spring meant new crops, new hope, and new chances to build upon the work of the winter months. The fire that had once been the heart of the home during the cold nights would be used to heat the irons for plowing fields, preparing for the coming season. The communal bond forged in the winter months would carry them into the new year, with a collective strength renewed by the shared labor and shared survival. And so the cycle continued. For the medieval peasants, survival was not just about enduring the moment. It was about preparing for what came next. And even as they faced the icy grip of winter, they never stopped looking forward. Because in the end, it was spring, rebirth, renewal, and hope that kept them going. Part 14. The endurance of a winter's night. As the long, dark winter nights dragged on, there was one undeniable truth. The nights were made for survival. It wasn't just the cold that tested a peasant's resolve. It was the stillness, the silence that stretched on for hours. The howling wind outside had become a familiar, almost comforting sound, a constant companion to the flickering flames inside. But it wasn't just the elements that posed a challenge. It was the very act of enduring the cold. It wasn't a matter of comfort. It was about making it through the night. In these harsh conditions, sleep was both a gift and a gamble. The bed, made of straw and rough-hewn cloth, offered little protection against the biting cold. The peasants' bodies, wrapped in multiple layers of rough woolen tunics and cloaks, had to adapt to the frigid temperatures. Each night, the family huddled together, their bodies pressed tightly to one another, seeking warmth in numbers. Privacy wasn't just a luxury, it was an alien concept. But that didn't matter. What mattered was staying warm enough to survive the night. The fire in the hearth, always a flickering and unreliable source of warmth, had to be monitored carefully. It wasn't a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life or death. If the fire went out, so too did the chance of waking up alive. Every peasant knew that. They learned to bank the fire with ash, an ancient technique that allowed the embers to survive through the night, just enough to rekindle the flames in the morning. But if the fire went out, if the wind blew too hard and the embers were lost, there was no recourse. There were no extra blankets, no space heaters. Only the bitter cold and the chance that you would not wake up with your limbs intact. Children learned quickly to sleep through the night, to roll into the warmth of a sibling's body, to press their hands against their parents' backs for the residual heat. They learned that warmth was a shared commodity, something that was given and taken, passed from one to the next like a sacred trust. The human body heat, gathered together in a pile of bodies, was as much a tool of survival as the fire itself. In those moments, the family wasn't just surviving together, they were living together in the truest sense of the word. Part 15. The Eternal Bond Family, Hearth, and Hope. There was, however, a deeper bond that held families together beyond survival. In the long, lonely winter nights, the hearth was a place where the stories were told, where laughter and sometimes tears were shared, and where family members came together in a way they couldn't during the busy harvest months. In a world where the days were filled with labor, the nights offered a rare opportunity to pause, to reflect, and to simply be. It was during these nights that peasants would pass down their knowledge, lessons about the world, about survival, and about what it meant to be human. Fathers told their children about the old ways, about how their ancestors survived even harsher winters, and how the land they lived on had shaped their lives. Mothers, too, had their stories of love, of loss, and of everything in between. These stories, though simple and often unsophisticated by modern standards, carried a profound weight. They reminded the family that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that as long as they had each other, they could endure whatever the world threw at them. The warmth of the fire, the closeness of the family, and the shared stories that filled the air were what made the long nights bearable. It wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about finding meaning in the struggle, finding joy in the small things, and remembering that despite the suffering, there was a future that would come with the return of the sun, with the arrival of spring, and with the hope that somehow things would get better. It was during these moments, around the hearth, that peasants often found a sense of peace. The harshness of winter, the endless cold, and the threat of hunger couldn't take away the connection they shared with one another. In the depths of the dark, cold nights, it was that bond, the unbreakable bond of family, that gave them strength. It gave them hope, Part 16. The Cycle of Life from Winter to Spring. As the days stretched on, and the first signs of spring slowly began to appear, the peasants' thoughts turned to the future. They had survived the winter, but now it was time to rebuild, to plant, and to prepare for the next season. Spring wasn't just a time of renewal for the land. It was a time of renewal for the family, for the community, and for life itself. With the arrival of the first warm days, the peasants would gather their tools, their seeds, and their hopes for the coming harvest. The harshness of winter would soon be forgotten in the flurry of planting, tending, and cultivating. It was a hard life, but it was a life that was deeply rooted in the cycles of the earth. It was a life that was about resilience and rebirth. In the spring, the fire would still burn in the hearth, but now it would serve a different purpose. It would cook the first of the season's vegetables, the bread made from the newly harvested grain, and the meat from the first slaughter. It would no longer be just a symbol of survival. It would be a symbol of hope and prosperity. Spring brought more than just warmth. It brought a promise that, no matter how harsh the winter had been, life would continue. The fields would bloom again, the animals would return, and the peasants would rise, just as they had done for centuries before. And so the cycle continued, from winter's harshest depths to spring's first blooms. It was the cycle of life, of survival, and of hope. Part 17. A legacy carved in time, the unseen strength of the peasant. The legacy of the medieval peasant is often overlooked. History tends to focus on the kings, the queens, the warriors, and the great events that shaped the course of nations. But the real strength of any civilization lies in the endurance of its people. The peasants who lived through every season, who struggled against the elements, who fought to survive in a world where death was never far away, they were the true backbone of society. Their lives were hard, their days filled with labor and hardship, but they were also filled with moments of love, joy, and resilience. The stories of medieval peasants are not just tales of survival. They are tales of strength, of hope, and of an unbreakable spirit. They endured the cold of winter, the heat of summer, and the hardships of every season in between, never giving up, never losing faith in the future. Today, when we look back at the medieval world, we should remember that it was the peasants who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. They were the ones who sowed the fields, harvested the crops, and tended to the animals. They were the ones who endured the winter's cold, who huddled together for warmth, and who kept the flame of hope alive. Their lives were simple, but in that simplicity lay a strength that has carried through the ages, a strength that we can still learn from today. So, the next time you find yourself shivering in the cold, or struggling to make it through a difficult time, remember the peasants. They survived the worst winters, and in doing so, they created a legacy of endurance and hope that has lasted through the centuries. Continued reflection on peasant resilience through the winters. The cold didn't just freeze the bones, it tested the spirit. For medieval peasants, winter was a time of survival, but it was also a time when the strength of human bonds became their greatest defense. In the face of bitter frost, it was their togetherness that shone brightest. As much as they dreaded the biting winds, there was something deeply communal about the way they fought the cold. At night, their homes, often little more than crumbling mud and thatch, became sanctuaries of warmth and human connection. When you're huddling together for warmth, physical proximity became not just a necessity, but a source of comfort. A mere glance across the room, shared space on the straw-filled mattress, or the gentle rise and fall of a loved one's breath in the dark night air brought a sense of safety. The fire, sputtering as it might have been, was more than just a source of heat. It was a beacon, a small flickering light that represented hope amidst the ever-encroaching darkness. As the wind howled outside, those gathered around the hearth weren't just warming their bodies. They were nourishing their souls. Old stories were passed down, memories were shared, laughter sometimes rang out, loud and defiant in the face of the cruel winter. And yet, this human warmth wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. The fires didn't just keep them alive, they gave them a reason to keep living. A reminder that, even in the harshest seasons, humanity can find a way to cling together, to protect one another. The cold was unyielding, but so were they. Families, often made up of several generations, slept close, nestled in their shared discomfort. Those who had the privilege of resting near the fire, wrapped in their layers of rough wool and tattered blankets, held on to every last bit of heat. And for those further from the hearth, it was the warmth of another body that made all the difference. The body heat of children, of elderly parents, of farm animals kept the frostbite at bay, if only for a while. When the wind howled so fiercely that it seemed to tear the walls apart, families would turn to one another, holding tightly, not just for warmth, but for that shared strength that came from knowing that together, they could face whatever the winter threw their way. Yes, the winters were harsh, and yes, survival was a daily battle. But within this struggle was a profound beauty, an unspoken testament to the resilience of the human spirit. For the medieval peasant, survival wasn't about luxury or ease. It was about waking up each morning with the strength to try again. It was about the warmth of another's hand, the quiet laughter shared in the coldest of rooms, and the unwavering belief that, as long as the hearth still burned, there was hope. Continued reflection on peasant resilience. As much as the cold threatened to tear at their bones, it never quite managed to unravel the thread that tied them together. The long nights, lit only by the occasional flicker of a candle or the sputtering hearth, were marked by stories. Elders, whose voices carried the weight of years, spoke of times when the winters were even worse, when famine and disease had taken more lives than the cold ever could. But through those stories, there was something constant, a thread of hope that wove its way through even the darkest tales. The children, huddled close, would listen wide-eyed as their grandparents recounted the days of their youth, not with fear but with laughter and a sense of triumph. "We survived," they would say, "because we had each other." The elderly, despite the aches in their bones and the toll that age had taken, were the guardians of resilience. They were living proof that winters could be survived, and that there was always a way through no matter how hard the storm. For these peasants, the winter wasn't just a time of survival, it was a time of solidarity. The homes weren't just places to sleep and eat, they were places where people found meaning, where survival was measured not by the thickness of the walls or the warmth of the blankets, but by how much love and strength could be shared within those walls. Outside, the fields lay barren, crops withered under frost, and the earth itself seemed to freeze in time. But inside their homes, these peasants found a resilience that was far more than physical. It was an emotional force, born from a shared sense of purpose. They didn't just endure, they made the best of it. They found laughter, joy, and moments of peace amidst the struggle. Neighbors, too, played their part. In the dead of night, if one house's fire had gone out, someone from the next door would slip through the snow, bundled tightly, and bring a glowing ember wrapped in rags to reignite the hearth. These small acts were more than kindness. They were survival tactics, reminders that community was their greatest weapon against the cold. Better to freeze together than alone, some might have joked, but in truth they meant it. They lived and died by this unspoken pact. And when spring did finally arrive, it wasn't just the thawing earth they celebrated. It was the triumph of making it through another brutal season. The first warmth of the sun was greeted not just by the planting of crops, but by the return of laughter, the sound of children's feet running freely in the now softened earth, and the shared relief of families who had managed to live another day together. Further reflection on human ingenuity and creativity amidst hardship. In the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, medieval peasants found ingenious ways to adapt to their environment. These were not simple people as history often paints them. No, these were individuals who navigated a world where death from the cold, hunger, or disease was never far away. Yet, in their survival, there was an art to living, a testament to their ingenuity and their understanding of the world around them. Take, for instance, their methods of food preservation. While the fields lay dormant under the weight of winter's frost, these peasants had learned how to coax sustenance from the earth even when it seemed to offer nothing. They cured meats in salt, stored roots in cool cellars, and relied on dried beans and grains that could withstand the harsh months. The smells of pickling, drying, and preserving permeated the air. These practices were born out of necessity, but they also served to demonstrate a deep knowledge of the land. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about preserving hope, preserving life, no matter how fleeting it might seem in those long, cold months. Beyond food, they found ways to stay warm that went beyond the layering of clothing. The use of natural insulation, moss, rags, and animal pelts became their armor against the biting winds. But their creativity didn't stop there. In their homes, the construction of earthen walls, layered with mud and dung, was as much an art as it was a necessity. The technique might sound rudimentary, but it worked, transforming the tiny huts from cold, drafty shelters into surprisingly effective insulation against the elements. These walls, built with care and attention, were as much a symbol of resourcefulness as they were of the deep connection between these people and the land they lived on. In fact, the very construction of their homes was an act of survival, a reflection of the delicate balance they maintained with nature. They learned to work with the landscape, not just on it. In the winter, the thatched roofs, though far from perfect, held their ground. Snow would settle on top, and while thatch might sag or leak, it would also act as an insulating layer, preventing the worst of the cold from penetrating the walls. Even the livestock, often seen as mere sources of food or labor, were vital parts of the warmth equation. These animals weren't just tools. They were co-survivors. Peasants brought them inside during the coldest nights, huddling with goats, sheep, chickens, and even cows, ensuring that every bit of body heat was maximized. In many ways, the bond between animal and human during these times was reciprocal. The animals kept them warm, and the peasants kept the animals fed and safe. It was a delicate balance, one that demanded resourcefulness and endless adaptability. In a world where resources were limited and the weather unforgiving, these peasants had no room for waste. Every scrap of fabric was saved for another layer of warmth. Every piece of wood, every ember was used with intention. They weren't just getting by, they were inventing new ways of life each day, piecing together their survival from whatever scraps the earth and their environment gave them. This ingenuity, this determination to make do with what they had, is something that echoes through the centuries. It wasn't just about surviving winter. It was about learning to thrive in spite of it, drawing strength not from comfort, but from their unbreakable will to live and to help others do the same. Emotional resonance of shared survival, the heart of community. In the frigid darkness of the medieval winter, when the wind howled outside and the cold seemed to seep into every crevice of the earth, it wasn't just warmth that kept peasants alive. It was their sense of community, the unspoken bonds that tied them together. It wasn't just about surviving as individuals. In those long, dark nights, survival became a shared endeavor. No peasant truly lived alone. The concept of privacy was almost non-existent, and in these conditions it wasn't something anyone longed for. Privacy was a luxury, a far-off idea that didn't have the time or the place to take root in the hearts of those who needed to band together to make it through. Imagine it, the humble family huddled together in a tiny room, the walls barely holding the cold at bay, each body pressed against the next, seeking the shared warmth that could only come from closeness. A little warmth, a little heat. This was their only defense against the unforgiving chill of winter. But this proximity wasn't just about physical warmth. It was emotional warmth too. The act of survival was emotional too. It was the quiet moments around the fire, the stories shared, the laughter or the silence that enveloped the room. In those moments, peasants became more than just neighbors or family members. They became lifelines. Whether it was the grandmother who kept the fire stoked throughout the night, or the child who huddled under their mother's cloak, everyone had a role to play. Everyone contributed. It wasn't just survival in the physical sense, it was emotional survival, a collective act of holding each other up through the long, dark nights. Their shared hardship also fostered a profound sense of belonging and trust. These were not just relationships built on blood or geography. They were relationships forged in the furnace of adversity. In winter, when the cold was so intense that it seemed to seep into the very bones, it wasn't enough to be simply near someone. You had to rely on them body, heart, and soul. The person who sat beside you on a cold bench might one day be the very person who saved your life with an extra blanket, a hot drink, or a kind word. The act of sharing the little you had, giving without expecting anything in return, became a cornerstone of the peasant way of life. Their survival was a shared story, one that was lived and told, not alone but together. Communities also knew the importance of collective rituals, of bringing people together not just for survival but for emotional release. Winter brought a sense of solemnity, yes, but it also brought with it communal moments that gave hope. Festivals, however small, gatherings by the hearth, and communal feasts during the winter solstice. These were more than just breaks from the cold. They were expressions of hope and togetherness. Amidst all the hardships, these rituals reaffirmed their identity, their continuity, and their ability to persevere. In the dead of winter, people would turn to music, to dance, to prayer, and to laughter as acts of defiance against the cold. The human spirit, after all, cannot be frozen. As cold as the stone walls might be, the warmth of a shared story, a shared song, could ignite a fire in the heart that no wind could extinguish. So even in the bleakest hours, peasants found joy in the most unlikely places. They found it in each other, in the simple comfort of knowing that you were not alone. The legacy of medieval resilience. The resilience displayed by these peasants didn't just keep them alive. It shaped a culture. One that, despite being forgotten by many, laid the foundations for the world we live in today. They were not simply surviving winter. They were laying down the bedrock for future generations. The resourcefulness, the sense of community, and the quiet ingenuity they displayed were lessons passed down through generations. These were not just techniques for surviving the cold. They were the tools of human resilience. And this resilience wasn't just a momentary thing. It lingered in the culture long after the winter had passed. It echoed in the stories they told, in the bonds they built, and in the ways they cared for one another. Over time, the lessons learned in the cold of winter shaped how they approached every challenge in life. From the way they raised children to the way they built homes to the way they cared for their land and livestock. Everything reflected this quiet, unyielding determination to persist, to adapt, and to find warmth, both literal and emotional, in the coldest of times. It was this same resilience that fueled the rise of communities. From the smallest village to the grander towns, these peasants, who had once been thought of as nothing more than nameless faces, built empires of resilience. It was the frostbitten hands of these very people who, in their quiet survival, helped pave the way for the survival of communities that would one day flourish. In the end, it wasn't the tools they had or the grandeur of their homes that ensured their survival. It was the human connection, their ability to adapt, their capacity to find warmth, to give warmth, and to live and love in the harshest of conditions is what truly defined their legacy.